Hello, I'm Torrin Walker. Welcome to episode 9 of the Black Male Study Session. This is a series of discussions and roundtables focused on addressing the issues affecting Black men and boys. This series is sponsored by the African American Men's Historical Society. The AMHIS is a Black American men's intellectual society focused on the preservation, history, and empowerment of Black men. Go to amhis.org to learn more and visit their Substack at amhis.substack.com. Black men are the canaries in America's political coal mine. The death, violence, and dehumanization inflicted on them has always been a barometer of the limits of racial justice in the United States. Black male death has also served as a catalyst for concerned white people to get involved and sometimes put their bodies on the line. This has served two purposes. The power structure knew it couldn't attack white people with the impunity it could Black people, thereby serving as an effective shield, and white people in protest provided legitimacy to people who otherwise wouldn't care about the plight of oppressed dark people. The recent killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy during anti-ICE protests in Minneapolis have changed that little rule. While there is outrage, there is also vocal disdain for their white lives that hasn't been seen before, or at least since the 1970s and the Kent State Massacre. This has happened before. The murders of James Reeb and Viola Luzo and Swerner, Cheney, and Goodman freedom rides of the 1960s sparked outrage. But the difference now is Good and Preddy weren't killed by vigilantes like the Klan or the White Citizens Council, but by legal agents of the state. I wanted to unpack some of this with Professor Tommy J. Curry. If you're familiar with the Black Male Studies sessions, that you know that Professor Tommy J. Curry, PhD, MPH, and Personal Chair of Africana Philosophy of Black Male Studies, Department of Philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, School of Philosophy, Psychology, and Language Sciences. He's also the author of The Man Not: Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, winner of the 2018 American Book Award, and a foundational text in the field of Black male studies. Dr. Curry, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. How are you doing today, brother?
I'm doing good. I'm doing well. It's good to have you back on the mic so we can have another episode of the Black Male Study Sessions. And as always, thank you for coming through.
No, thank you as always for the invitation.
All right, well, let's jump right into it. Why has white pain historically been given more weight than black death in the United States?
Well, white life has mattered more than black life in the history of the United States. Um, we've I think encountered something that we're very used to seeing over the last 40 years, and that's almost as long as I've been alive. We have seen the repetitive use of violence and indifference to the murder of black people, especially black men in the United States. What troubles me about this moment is not that we see the groundswell of resistance uh, protesting the deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. That's to be expected. What I am most concerned about is that it seems that Black Americans still seem to be losing the point. Over the last several weeks, we've seen post after post of Black pundits, Black commentators, and Black academics reacting to these murders. And what they've all said has been, well, something to the effect that, Black people have been experiencing racism for centuries, and fascism, as white people are now calling it in the United States, is merely the experiences of racism Black people have had for centuries on it. What concerns me about this rhetoric is not necessarily that it's incorrect or a strong disagreement with it, but it's a failure to understand the reality and the true picture that we're dealing with. What we're seeing in the United States is not simply the matter of politics. Black life cannot be understood as just the inconvenience of the political moment. When Mr. Porter was killed on New Year's Eve, we heard nothing about it. There was no outrage. And we understand that because when black men are shot by cops in the United States generally, there's very little outrage. There may be symbolic uses of our death, You may see people get grants, jobs, or other accolades for saying they're protesting this injustice. But the life of the black men lost, the black men and boys lost, doesn't really matter. What we have happening now in the United States is this idea, right? And this is what's scary about it. We have this idea that if Trump was not president, that somehow the fascism, as we're calling it, this kind of unbridled violence and this political asymmetry between Republicans and liberals, where now even white people's lives are being held over the fire, so to speak, wouldn't exist. And that's the dishonesty that concerns me. The issue here is not whether or not we voted for Kamala or someone else. Even under the Obama administration, we saw black men slaughtered in the United States. We saw all lives matter being championed to protect police and militarized forces against civilian populations when they were working class, poor, and black. And that didn't arouse any suspicion of the system. The system was not called to answer for that. What they said was we need body cameras and training. But now that you have a Trump administration that wants to whitewash the population of the United States and is willing to kill other white people to do it, now we see white people mobilizing a kind of structural account of how ideology is playing a role in the denigration of certain people's lives. And while that can be expected, we see black academics and pundits on schedule as usual, trying to latch their careers, latch their message to the black community on this idea. You see, the deaths of Good and Preddy gave white people a sensibility for a moment of what it meant to be racialized in this country. I saw Cornel West discussing this as niggerization. But the difference between this is that there is a moral capacity, there's a violation of moral good that white people did not expect to happen under Trump. So when white people in mass, white men and white women voted overwhelmingly for the Trump administration, they understood that Trump was going to direct his anger, his violence, and his vitriol to black and brown people, to people they thought did not belong in the United States. But now that white people are becoming victims of that because Trump has said, well, there's a certain kind of white person we want. We want white people that's dedicated to the cause, the ideology, and the religion of white supremacy. They don't understand why they're victims. And instead of black people saying, well, listen, the issue with black life is not an amendment to the outrage white people are feeling about white life, we pretend that it's all the same bag. Said differently, if Kamala Harris had won the presidency, you would still see black men being shot. Keith Porter Jr. would have still happened under a Kamala presidency. And we would not have had any kind of different reaction to it or introduced the notion that we're living under a fascist state. So what we've done is that we've internalized the idea that the only time that we can truly make statements about the destruction of American democracy and the collapse of our civilization is when white people die, not black people. We have witnessed and endured the deaths of black men and boys in this country for over a decade. And we've seen that happen with police cameras and social media. We all know that black Americans, black men and black women, have been crucified for over centuries. But what we've done is we've said, hey, that's the price of progress. Our American democracy worked absolutely fine when it was black people being killed. Over the last 10 years, we celebrated Obama, right, as a beacon, as a symbol, as the best president, even though black men and boys were being killed. But now that white people are being killed, now suddenly America is dying. America is falling. My disappointment is that we don't understand that black life doesn't become more valuable just because we hooked it onto white life. So we've constantly done this. We've had an academic class that has sold us progress, told us that it's okay that some of us die and are murdered in the street like animals because that's the price of democracy. But the same black academics, the same black pundits, the same black commentators that we see on the news channels are telling us now, wait, our civilization is failing. Not because hundreds of black men died, but because two white people have died, right? This is part of the mentality that we've created to justify and really participate in our own oppression and demise in the United States. The violence that we're seeing right now, right, has nothing, doesn't hold a candle to what black people went through Jim Crow segregation. Doesn't hold a candle to what we went through during enslavement. But somehow, right, white America is outraged. There was a senator saying that this was worse than the civil rights movement, that somehow we've never seen two people killed in the streets. They were lynching people. They were cutting off black men's genitalia. They were cutting babies from women's stomachs, cutting their wombs. So for black people to see this terror, it's not enough to just say that we witnessed it and acknowledge the contradiction. The real question is why we've tolerated it. If we can see the outrage that white America has when two of their people are unjustly killed, and I'm not denying sympathy for Renee Good or for Alex Preddy, but I'm saying that if two white people's deaths can change the way that white people see what America is, certainly hundreds of years of black people's deaths should have had an even greater resonance with these people, and even more so with our own people who've been selling us the myth of progress and democracy over the last several decades. We're overlooking how law, how state power defines entities. We examine systems as if it's merely an issue of bias, that people are making racist judgments. And that's certainly true at an individual to individual level. But we have to understand that we live in a system and a society where law and mechanisms of power are constructing the entities that we think we exist in. We are taught to think that we're citizens that have natural rights. But what's the difference between the government calling us citizens and just deciding some random day that we're terrorists, or better yet, black identity extremists? You see, this aspect of how our civic society operates is not something that we've educated our people on. We've maintained the illusion that progress or equality or human rights or our constitutional rights are things that will be respected. So, as you mentioned in the situation for Lando Castro, he's legally allowed to handle a gun. Same thing with Freddie. He had the legal right to conceal and carry, right? But at the time, I said, well, that makes you a terrorist. You see, we've lived in a world where we've assumed that the rule of law and that our constitutional rights protect us. And for decades, right, we always talk about critical race theory in name, but we don't talk about it in terms of its practice. What Derek Bell and Richard Delgado were saying, they said, what happens when those in power decide not to follow the rules they've set for everybody else? You see, that's the indictment. That's the power of the critique of critical race theory. That it sees the law as just an illusion, something to be played with and changed and made malleable by those who have the most money and the most power. So when you say, hey, people have a legal right to carry, not if the cop wants to identify you as a threat, the gun that was in his holster for Mr. Castile was just the excuse or the rationalization needed to execute him in front of his family. Alex Preddy tries to protect a woman that was being accosted and assaulted by ICE. His gun was a justification for him to be killed because he's a terrorist that was going to use it against ICE agents. Notice none of these things actually are true, but the state has the power to construct people any way they want. And again, we've watched this happen in real time for decades concerning black men. We've seen innocent black men when they were running away from cops still being said to have been a threat to them that they felt they had to shoot them to protect their life. And that justification has resonated with many white Americans, right? It's resonated with the people who said that I just can't believe that Alex Preddy, who was a veteran nurse that took care of people, right, would be said to be this. So you don't believe that white people see this is what I mean about the character and integrity of white life. The white person says we don't believe this is what Alex Purdy was. His family gives testimonies. His loved ones give testimonies. His patients give testimonies. And his character is standing up to the state's attempt to assassinate it. But when a black man is killed, suddenly anything that he's done in his whole life, He's disagreed or yelled at his girlfriend or wife. He didn't vote in the way that people thought he should vote. He didn't hold the politics people thought he should hold. And that becomes a justification for the assassination of his character by the state. So we have to get over this idea that we live in a time where technology and where constitutional rights and where the rule of law is something that's firm, stable, and agreed upon. We have no answer to Trump because we did not anticipate, despite being told for years, right, by black intellectuals, that you have a system that will bend to the will of the most powerful. Trump's decided to call out of the lines, and the Supreme Court, the Congress, no one's checking that power. So when we rationalize, right, when we try to explain to ourselves what's going on between, say, Castile and Preddy, we have to understand that this is what societies decide that we are. State power allows the government to decide what your fate's going to be. And the illusion of freedom that we've been telling ourselves for decades on end, for centuries, right? That we can get this pocket and this pail of freedom that would be safeguarded by the law and constitution is just a lie. If we don't start challenging, if we don't start re-educating and re-socializing ourselves, no amount of commentary, no amount of performance is going to save our people from the violent fate that awaits us. Because let's be very clear about this. If you have an extra legal organization like ICE that is now being said to have the constitutional powers to kill civilians, white civilians, the only conclusion that we can have as black people is that it's open season because there's no legal protections and there's certainly not going to be any amount of social pressure that's going to protect white life with black life with white life's already in danger.
All right. Um, as you just mentioned, the old social justice contract I talked about earlier at the beginning of the show isn't working anymore. What exactly has changed in the culture where the system is comfortable killing white men and white women too? Because as you mentioned, Pretty died defending a woman, but even that social contract doesn't even apply anymore.
Well, listen, white people have always killed white people, right? This is the thing. We white people have always found a reason, either based on ethnicity or class or even religion, to kill one another. The difference is that in America, black people absorbed much of that social animus. Right? What Trump has done is redefine the boundaries of whiteness. He's now said that to actually be a white person is to be undoubtedly conservative, to be unwavering in American patriotism, to be Christian, to support right white supremacy and patriarchy, to believe in American imperialism and realist international power. Those are the characteristics by which he's defining whiteness now. And this tells people like to say that race is a social construct, right? It's the first thing you learn when you go to university. But they don't really believe it because if they understood what that meant, it means that people in certain regimes of power can create whoever they want. Trump's recreated whiteness. He's recreated who are minority groups and who've been oppressed. Right? You see, we're not making that connection. Trump said, listen, white people are the ones who were discriminated against during the civil rights movement. And he's pushed state governments to agree with him. Right? The threat, I know the Supreme Court case or the appeal, they're not going forward with the appeal on DEI, but you've already had institutions all across the country reverse their stances on inclusion and diversity, change textbooks, take down Black History monuments, the same symbols that they were, celebrating mere months ago. So what's at stake here is to understand that people can construct history, lives, entities, individual rights, and personalities any way they so choose. And now that there are groups of white people who the right now see as enemies, it's not just fake news. They see liberal whites as enemies of the state, right? Remember what when Walt said that he wanted ICE out of Minnesota, Trump said, "Okay, hand us your voting rolls." Right? These it's a regime. It's a new way of looking at how social order is going to be established. So in this world, white liberals, right? And this is the crazy part. White liberals who have considered themselves to be the vanguard of not only American education and wealth and privilege, right? Because they were the educated avant-garde of American politics, right? They're the ones that are now being targeted by Trump. And because of that, they see themselves now becoming more and more expendable. They see themselves endangered, not for the color of their skin, but because of their political ideas. If you disagree with Trump, this is treason, right? So what we're seeing is a shift in the way that white people are going to be defined. We see the same thing happening here in the UK with Farage's Reform Party. We see the same thing with the nationalists in Canada. I said a few weeks ago, in a world where ethno-nationalism becomes the basis of white societies, whiteness then becomes empowered to decide who's not white enough. And that's all you're having happen right now. The problem is we didn't believe that this could happen. We're seeing things and we're seeing history move in a way that we didn't think was possible in a democratic society. So is it really a question of whether or not that was impossible or us understanding that maybe America wasn't a democracy to begin with? Like I said, we've accepted the deaths of black men and women. We've accepted the brutal murder of black men and boys. And we said we could deal with that because that's a group we don't empathize with much. And that's not too high of a price to pay for democracy. And now that the same thing's happening to white liberals, people who are resisting Trump and resisting ICE, two white lives, and people are saying that it's enough. I saw a piece that was written in The Guardian where a white woman, a white journalist said they can't kill us all. That the ICE raids are remnant of a racial past where the KKK terrorized black people. So you see automatically, right, that the associate people know. They know about the racist history and violence that targeted black people. American journalism, right? The very notion of human rights is situated on not being the victims of racist terror. But even when that happens, even in the 21st century, right? Like on New Year's Eve with Mr. Porter, they don't write the article for Mr. Porter. They write it for Renee Good and Alex Preddy, right? So we have to accept, we have to change our minds. We have to revolutionarily reconceptualize how American society works. And this actually Trump's right on time. This is what generally happens in the first decades of new centuries in the United States.
All right. Um, After the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X said that the violence America employs around the world has reached its shores and its children. His famous chickens coming home to roost analogy.
Yes, yes.
Does this more subdued reaction to the deaths of Good and Preddy, even in spite of the protests that we do see, does that mean that we've turned a corner on empathy in this country, or are we just returning to ancestral patterns?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a great question. Um, I really, America has such a long history of murder that it would be disingenuous to say that we've turned a corner. I think the safety net that's comforted white people for so long has been removed. I think now that the target of Trump's violence is not just black people, but even the not white enough white people, that we've now seen um, a binary in what America's political conscience is. White people who don't support Trump, white people who don't support white civilization and culture, are now enemies to that culture. And that's what I mean about the term not white enough. I understand the effect that Cornel West was going for with the idea of niggerization, but we're seeing a bifurcation in white identity that says that if it's not about protecting white progeny, white families, and white civilization against these kind of external threats, be they black, be they African, be they Muslim, etc., then we have to look at those people as threats to the overall survival of the white race. And Trump is being very clear, I think, about what he's willing to do to preserve that, which is why I think he still remains so popular among his base. Right? You have to remember that the Republicans are the people we used to refer to as the alt-right that are now in power, very much see the survival of their race as the foremost grounding for politics. So when they were pushing this idea of replacement theory, when Tucker Carlson was making his appearances talking about the ways that whites were becoming minorities, even in places like London and the UK, right? These people are very clear that the politics is meant to preserve and propagate white racial, white, I mean, the future of the white race is meant to secure that, be it with power or be it with violence. So I think this is ancestral patterns, right? We've heard this argument before. We heard this at the turn of the 20th century, right? That's why, people always quote Du Bois's "the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line," but they don't consider what was going on during that period of time. Lynchings, mass murders, riots, racial slaughterings, right? Like this is what Du Bois was talking about, the decimation of populations. And because Americans are so individualistic, they don't see what's happening as the contouring and confirmation of certain populations. This is social engineering, right? Just think about it logically. If Trump finishes out his 4 years, right, and if they secure power, they're going to hold the Supreme Court. That's not going to change. If they still do well in the midterms, there's a very likely chance that they'll be able to hold the Congress. Whoever comes in is not going to be budged. And if you get someone who's an ideological predecessor to Trump, you're talking about a decade where people are going to be socialized in the idea that white civilization was under attack, that the civil rights movement put white people in danger. They became weaker, they became vulnerable, and that you had migrant populations and domestic terrorists that were trying to destroy a white country. And it was Trump who saved them. It was ICE who made the republic white. It was Trump who made sure that white people, white families, and white men were restored to their former glory. So these patterns that we're seeing are not anything that's aberrational. They're not even unexpected. They're something that we've documented throughout history. The problem is when we think there's been change. And I think, and Derek Bell, in his last book before he died, he said, one of the major problems that Black Americans have with trying to reconcile the position that they're in the United States is they choose to embrace the symbol over reality. And what we've done is we've rationalized and contoured, we warped reality to try to pretend that there's these symbols of progress and hope. And even now, even from overseas, I mean, the news cycles are around a day behind sometimes in the UK, but you can see how the punditry in the United States is changing, right? How Black pundits are talking about the crisis of what Trump is doing and trying to feed off of the resistance that's growing among white people for the loss of white life. So think about what that means. That means that we have to change our terms of speaking. We can't protest for Black people anymore because race doesn't resonate among white liberals who are worried about their lives first and foremost. So now we have to be the appendage, right? We're the political appendage now to white outrage against Trump. We have to say and pretend that we're outraged just as much as they are about Pretty and Good, even though our people have been slaughtered in the hundreds. Right? So this is ancestral patterns, and because Black people don't have the same resentment towards America that we once had, we're in a much weaker position to address this. Lots of more people are going to die, white and Black alike. The real question, though, is at the end of the day, are we fighting to return back to a system where white women enjoyed almost 80% of all diversity jobs and we were ruled through our underrepresentation in key sectors and institutions in America? Or do we have a different version, a different future? I truly believe that Black people cannot simply return to what was lost before Trump. We can't return to that kind of debased deficit system where we took crumbs and said that that was racial progress and equality. There has to be a much broader vision of what equality looks like. And that's not what's being introduced in these conversations right now. We're merely reacting and trying to attach ourselves to the outrage that white people have about the murder of these two white people.
I want to take a moment to do some quick house cleaning. If you're just coming in, thank you for joining the conversation. This is the Black Male Study Sessions, episode 9. You're All Black Now is the name of the conversation. This series is sponsored by the African American Men's Historical Society. The AMHIS is a Black American Men's Intellectual Society focused on the preservation, history, and empowerment of Black men. Go to amhis.org to learn more and visit their Substack at amhis.substack.com. Also, to let people know, we're going to try to have a brief Q&A at the end of the conversation. And I want to say this before we get down that road, it's going to be a Q&A, not a soapbox. So if you have questions for Dr. Curry, let me know, shoot me a DM, and I'll try to get you in. Um, Dr. Curry, let's move the conversation into a little bit more of a darker tone, even though the whole conversation is pretty dark. Let's discuss the casual brutality and sexual violence inflicted on captured males. Um,
Hmm.
we know we know the history of black men being castrated and violated during lynchings. There was the sexual humiliation and violation of Iraqi men and boys during the by the United States Army at Abu Ghraib. Um,
Hmm.
Male Palestinian detainees have reported being raped by members of the Israeli Defense Force in Gaza during the Gaza Israeli war. And now reports are coming out that males detained by ICE have had their testicles crushed and manhandled while in detention.
Yes,
Can you
yes.
can you talk a little bit about what this ritual of demasculization means for both the subjugated male and the power structure?
No, absolutely, absolutely. You know, in black belt studies scholarship, we call this phallicism. We talk about not just the sexual vulnerability of subjugated men, but their vulnerability to sexual violence and genital mutilation more broadly. So and this is what's really important. Black belt study scholars have really tried to highlight how racism operates as a kind of war, as a kind of low level conflict. Though the low level conflict reference comes from Sudanese, but we've talked about uh, racism as a way to control and contour populations. It's a demographic problem. And one of the ways that you assault both the psyche and the flesh of subordinate men is through sexual torture. And what you see being deployed by ICE is not just perversion of individuals, but you see them deploying a time tested pattern of violence that breaks populations. Um, and the way that we talk about racism doesn't often lend itself to this reality. In the United States, we've bought into this flawed idea that sexual violence and rape specifically are linked to femininity or to the position of women. But when you look at genocides, when you look at wars, when you look at lynchings, when you look at Jim Crow, stories and accounts of how segregation operated, you see horrible, horrible examples of black men's testicles being crushed, of their penises and genitalia being cut off, of forced penetration with people who were captured with them or family members. You have these stories that resonates so deeply with the hatred that white America has of black people and black men specifically that it becomes nonsensical not to make that connection. I think what ICE is doing is conducting domestic warfare. It is implementing both policies of surveillance and practices of control. It is being legitimized. I think we've talked a little bit about the Graham decision that allow cops to be saved from prosecution in the field when they use extraordinary violence. This idea that you have a presidency that's saying that ICE is not only police force but operating almost as a paramilitary force trying to keep order within the society, and you have people and conservative pundits justifying this, saying that they're acting on behalf of the president and enforcing the rule of law and order against people who are protesting them. I think that it means that we are being told and sold a narrative where the people that ICE captures and contains are in fact prisoners. Because like you said, we've seen this in Gaza, we've seen this in American prisons, we've seen this in every other context where people are no longer citizens and really are no longer seen as human beings. So the sexual violence that I think ICE is committing on these black and brown men from the stories that I've seen really does stand next to a campaign of war. And again, we've not had people really talk about this because I was looking for more articles about this situation, or even seeing if we got any coverage in the United States. And there's virtually none. So we're ill prepared to actually discuss, much less analyze, what happens when you take American citizens, racialized American citizens, specifically men, and the kinds of vulnerabilities they have to sexual violence. We don't even have a language to describe it, much less an understanding of how it operates. So there's not going to be any ability of us to actually address those kinds of human rights violations internationally or domestically. And again, this is why Black male studies scholars are constantly pushing this issue. That the issue is not politics. The issue is about the substance of racist brutality and oppression. Right? We are flying blind here because every time we get a conceptualization or try to get a conceptualization of what's really happening in the real world, right? Like just think about all the black men who have been victims of sodomy, who have been victims of molestation and sexual coercion during police stops. And no one wanted to talk about that. And now you have a kind of a military organization yanking people out of neighborhoods, pulling people off of the streets, and then sexually brutalizing them. These people will not only be psychologically scarred, but it will instill a ethos of fear and non-confrontation among racialized populations. So this is meant to break the spirit of any of those people who can resist. It's meant to, when you look at the genocide literature, it discusses how men who are victims of rape, castration, and genital mutilation are psychologically impeded from reproduction. Right? These are techniques of genocide and population control that we are acting like is not happening in the United States. So these sexual violations, the sexual violence, is indicative of a much larger pattern of different demographic control and lethal extermination.
There's a passage in George Orwell's 1984 where he explains that the membership in the elite of the totalitarian inner party isn't based on race or gender, and anyone can become a part of the inner party as long as they enforce the party's will on the rest of the population. According to the most recent data, 55% of ICE agents are white, but 19% are Latino,
Hmm.
15% are black or African American, 62% are men, yet 38% are women.
Yeah.
Is this an indicator of the system transcending ethnicity and approaching its Orwellian moment?
Oh, absolutely. But the systems always had agents that were of the oppressed population. Right. I mean, there's not a colonial context in history where you haven't had people who have edited and abetted the demise of their own people. Right. I mean, listen, the system, if we're going to refer to it that, but think about it, the system um prefers people that look like the population is trying to subjugate because it creates confusion among that population. Right. We're not operating in this sense in a clear black white issue. As if anything, I think the election demonstrated that. I mean, even though black men voted overwhelmingly for Kamala, they were still attacked as outsiders. We're not dealing with race in that simplistic sense. We are dealing with people who want to partake or who support a version of empire, nation, and Trump's power that sees that as the most beneficial world. So there are Latinos who are going to be against Mexicans. They who think they're dangerous, who think they're terrorists, who think they're of a different culture. Right? Same thing with black people. You will have black people who fundamentally believe that black people are dangerous and corrupt to American society, just like Africans from these shithole countries, as Trump would call them, coming into the country. The issue here is civilization, right? This is a civilizational war. This is not just a question of which race gets the power. This is a question of which race will dominate and dictate the terms by which we understand America for centuries, if not for decades, if not centuries to come. So no, it's certainly Orwellian in that pessimistic sense that people can become part of a system. But at the end of the day, too, it's also about what does the people who are in power aspire the world to be. And this is why they're attacking colleges and universities. This is why they're crushing any form of the ideology. This is why when we were talking about Project 2025 on the From the Henry Foundation, they're being very clear. This is to reprogram and re-socialize the American public. We're not having a debate about right or wrong. There is no rational debate happening in America. You have people with power saying what is right and what is true. You have people utilizing that power through violence to dictate which people get to speak and not speak and socialize the next generation. So the people who are acting for ICE are people who believe in the vision that a white supremacist America entails. And unfortunately, we've presumed incorrectly that that meant that, well, if you're a white supremacist, you're going to be white. And if you're not going to be white. And there's nothing that makes that true besides the fact that we've assumed that black people are in solidarity with one another when it's convenient. Because let's be very honest with ourselves. Black people in America separate themselves on anything from class to gender to sexuality to religion to, to football team. We're not a people that have any forms of cultural solidarity outside of the appeal to the history of suffering. So why would it then stand to reason that if we could separate ourselves on all these things, that somehow there wouldn't be black people that want to separate themselves from other black people based on their right wing ideology or their belief in white supremacist civilizational values or the belief in their patriotism about America,
Dr.
right?
Curry, I think that's a very good point. I want to stick with that for a minute because I think you raised something that people don't really think about when you talk about Black American culture. Because I've said this before, you've had the experience and the luxury to travel around. I've had the luxury and experience to travel around and see different places in the United States. And somebody who's born and raised in New York, who's Black, is going to have a totally different experience than somebody who's Black and raised in Miami. Somebody who's born and raised in
Absolutely.
Miami is going to be totally different than somebody who's raised in New Orleans. Somebody who's from the South is going to have a different experience of and culture than somebody who's based in LA. And I think people don't really understand it from the outside looking in, but people don't realize how many different separate nations we are as Black Americans within the United States, just in our own individual cultures.
No, I think you're absolutely right. But that's why throughout history there's always been a political mandate for black love and black communality. And what we've had, and this goes both for in society and in the academy, what we've had and what we've done is we've rewarded systems that have splintered us. We have rewarded systems that have told us that black men and women have nothing in common and that black women have more in common with white women than they do with their fathers and brothers and husbands. We've endorsed systems that have said on the basis of class position, you have nothing in common with poor black people. You see, that all happened after segregation because before segregation, all black people were the same. And I've said this recently. You see this situation where they're talking about the unemployment of 365,000 black women. That tells you something about the precariousness of these divisions. Though what we for years we've been arguing about, well, there's not enough good black men, enough educated black men. And in one white man's stroke of a pen, now all the black women who were saying that they were educated and benefited from this kind of middle class lifestyle are just like everybody else. You see, we fight about definitions that white people give us, and then we valorize those things as if they mark us as somehow exceptional to other black folk. And what we're seeing with ICE are black people and brown people and white women, right? Who say, well, look, I'm not going to be trapped by these definitions of a group. I support white supremacy. So of course you got 30% of the people that are 20 some percent of the people that are white women, that are joining the organization. What, do you really think that white women don't have a stake in white supremacy, don't have a stake in a strong white nation? White women have told us time and time again that the best security of white women's power and prestige and respect are strong white men in patriarchal societies that can keep other dark men outside of the country. Right? Like we're not paying attention. And then we get up and we give these grand speeches like we're saying something new because we're saying, oh, look at the kind of violence that's now trickling down to white America. Our issue is black people should be intolerance, not indifference, right? We don't gain anything by saying, oh, we already knew this, we already experienced that. Who are we saying that to? All the black people know that. The black people on ICE know that. They're just saying that they much rather be on the winning team than the not winning team. So we have a fundamental question to ask ourselves: are black people going to be one and breed solidarity despite our differences to combat this threat? Do we have a future in the United States? I think that's a very important question right now. And if we decide to stay in the United States, can politics actually remedy what is this fatal flaw in American democracy, which is the hatred of black people and the use of black people's death and oppression as a way to employ tactics against white people they've now decided are outsiders? Right? We have to get our head on straight about what's actually at stake here. And making cool posts on Twitter about fascism and racism isn't going to do that kind of work.
All right. Now it's time for a brief Q&A. Dr. Curry, do you have a few minutes to answer some questions?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. So this is the time. If you have questions for Dr. Curry, if you have anything you want to speak on about the conversation that we've had, put your hands up. I will get to you in the order that I see you. And also, again, because I'm learning that I'm having to do this now, if you have a question, make it a question, not a statement. If you have a question for the group, please make it a statement. We don't have 10 or 12 minutes for your manifesto. We just need you to ask your question. Just want to make that clear. So we're going to go around the room and we're going to go to philosopher King Myron. How you doing, brother? Microphone is yours.
Good, good. Thanks for letting me speak. I wanted to ask about, I liked what Dr. Curry was saying about ICE and the patterns that you see from it, but I wanted to ask about the response to the killing of Preddy and
Hmm.
the claiming and promoting of black radical ideas of militant self-defense by some.
Hmm.
Now, these ideas are usually demonized, but it seems like in the last few days, there's been more sharing and talking openly about that, about militant self-defense. Even though for the last decade, the people who advocate this are told that they're engaging in childlike dreams, that they're
Yeah.
misogynistic and backwards and non-practical. So I wanted to know what you think about that, like about how the academic elite navigates and instrumentalizes black militancy for times like this.
Well, look, I mean, in a lot of ways, you're preaching to the choir, right? Because for those who don't know, the major issue I had in the United States was that I had a small show on the Sirius XM, and I said that after they killed Tamar Rice, that Black people needed to really think about our right of self-defense. Because white vigilantes as well as police were murdering our children, and we shouldn't die in the street like animals. So I understand that. And to be honest with you, at this point, I just have to smile because, like you said, 10 years ago, I mean, actually, I did that in 2015, so over a decade ago, when I tried to have that conversation, I was said that I was backwards, ideological, etc. I think that it's empty symbolism, right? My view is that black people had a right to human dignity. That people who came in our communities and killed our children should not leave those communities the same way they entered. Because if the law wouldn't protect us, we had to protect ourselves. And I spoke specifically about self-defense, not unbridled killing of people or whatever, that lunatic Rod Dreher said. What's happening now, though, I think is somewhat irresponsible. We're talking about traditions of black militancy without an infrastructure. So we have armed guards, we have people that are rolling around in Humvees, and I think I saw someone almost in a damn near a tank in one of the cities, one of the pictures that was shared. What are black communities going to do against that kind of militarized police force, right? That has the backing from the federal government. We need to be strategic, right? The issue is not that we should stop conversations about black self-defense and black militancy. I think we should be having them. But some of the social media posts that I've seen shared about the Black Panther Party, some of the ideas about picking up guns unbridledly, if they're shooting white people that have legal, license to carry, they're going to slaughter black people, our children, our men, our women, etc. So black people need to start thinking about how this operates within this context. It needs to be specific. It can't just be let's just pick up guns or let's defend ourselves. It needs to be a conversation with lawyers. It needs to be a conversation with judges. black judges, black lawyers, about how we're going to protect our communities and what little rights we may have at local levels to justify our right to do so.
All right, let's go to Pedagogy in Black. Rennie Toure.
Yo, yo, what's going on, everyone? Thank you for allowing me to speak. My question pretty straightforward. I wanted to know, is there a consequence for not understanding the genealogy and practices that we see with the sexual torture of ICE today? And what I mean by that is, I did have a viral post, um, basically exploring this relationship in sexual torture from ICE that the
Hmm.
ACLU documented and the Guardian exposed as well. And what I showed is, of course, that you talk about this explicitly in your book, The Man Not, um, with Abner Lua, also Darren Manny. And we talk about
Hmm.
these police practices all the time in the sexual torture. You update this in Killing Boogeyman with phallicism. But some of the responses just kind of say, well, this comes out of the IDF, or, um, and they sort of like harken this back to what's happening in Palestine, which is definitely true. This did occur in
Hmm.
Palestine. But what is the consequence of not understanding the genealogy of this kind of sexual torture? Is there an epistemic gap here? Does it matter? Is it relevant that people understand that this didn't emanate necessarily from the IDF because they do practice it? Or is this necessary that people know this genealogy? Because, like, for example, when I think about like this as a product of war, particularly in counterinsurgencies, I know that like the sexual torture and rape of racialized male is simply like a harbinger of what can happen to the entire population. So, like through
Yeah, yeah,
pacification methods, under like this auspices of like civilian protection of women and children, like counterinsurgents often enter the domestic sphere through making home life for the population much more precarious, and making those people much more vulnerable to rape after they destroy the population of like insurgent males. So, what does it
yeah,
mean
yeah.
to not understand this strategy? And is it even relevant for strategy for people to know this kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, it's certainly relevant because we're talking about the mechanisms by which people are oppressed, right? And I think I really think that your question hits on something. We've told people, we've pretended we've understood racism, but we don't understand how racism is practiced, right? Because what we've done is we've replaced the ills of discrimination after the civil rights movement with an idea of what racism actually is. And I think that's the problem. The reason that we need to know this genealogy is because we, as I say in Killing Boogeyman and the Man Up, this is the expectation we should have of any colonized or repressed racial population, right? So the reason that it happened to black people in slavery and Jim Crow, the reason that it happened to Jews in the Holocaust and Armenians, right, is because what we see is that subordinate men are going to be slaughtered and decimated both in body and in mind. So the sexual torture is one aspect by which the body is betrayed and where the mind is going to turn in itself because it creates an almost insurmountable trauma, right? It's the same thing that we understand quite easily. We talk about the rape of women. We assume that the rape of women is something that leaves a permanent scar because it took away dignity and personhood. And I think that's true, but we don't see that when we come to these groups of men. So what we're claiming here is that the genealogy and the practice of sexual violence, torture, castration, right, and even sterilization, because in a lot of these cases, the crushing of testicles is about sterilizing the group as a means towards genocide. Is that we're pointing out that look, racism is practiced as a way to get populations to be incapable or resentful of themselves. And what we're seeing now with ICE and police, etc., is the production of a kind of violence that is internalized, where the mind destroys the body and impedes it. So think about this quite seriously. In this world, either a racialized man becomes physically incapable of reproducing, or he becomes so scarred and traumatized that he may become a sexual predator. He may deal with his trauma in ways that are not only self-destructive, but destructive to those around him, right? And these are all possibilities that happen when this kind of violence happens. There's no reason that we wouldn't study it the same way that we study lynching. We understand lynching because we're saying, look at what happens when we see a young black boy from a tree or a young black man hung from a tree. We understand that violence. This is something that we haven't understood or investigated well, which means that we're missing a big piece of what's happening in the way that these kind of wars or conflicts are conducted on civilian populations.
All right. Our next person for the Q&A is Dr. Tony Gaskew. He says he just likes to be called Tony, but I want to give respect to his title. So, Dr. Tony Gaskew, the microphone is yours.
All right. Hey, Tommy, how you doing today?
I'm well, Tony. How are you doing, brother?
Doing well, doing well. Well, what it reminds me today of a movie, Civil War, and there's a scene in the movie where a military member asks journalists, "What kind of American are you?" And
Hmm.
white liberals have found themselves in a situation where the scene is now, "What kind of white American are
Yeah,
you?"
exactly. Yeah.
And much of what you talked about today, myself, Dr. Gilmore, other scholars in counterinsurgency, we talk about the term pacification.
Hmm.
And we already know that white liberals have abandoned their black feminist allies in the academy. They've
Oh,
left them
absolutely.
to themselves.
Yeah.
My question for you is, how long do you think it takes the state to break the will of the everyday white liberal? That is, where they completely forget at some point they allied with black Americans.
Oh man, listen, Tony. I think two things. Two things. One, I agree with your point about abandoning black feminism, and I think that it's interesting that black feminists have uh, tried to angle that situation right as their indifference, is that they're going to just sit this out. They're sitting out because they don't have liberal funders anymore, right? So we need to be honest about that. It's not indifference. It's that you've lost your honeypot. Um, as the second point, that's really interesting because I think that it will happen within Trump's presidency. I truly believe, right, that if the Trump administration pulls off most of the things in the Project 2025 document, that white liberals will have to rewrite history in such a way that they will see themselves as opposed to or certainly distant from the kinds of black civil rights motifs that they've adopted over the last few years under police killings and certainly under Obama. Right? Because you have to think about what's happening. America's economy, its nation's not prospering, right? Everything we see, every major indicator from health to morale to employment are all going down. I mean, even the education system, the elite universities in America are losing compared to international ones. So what happens when white people now have to renegotiate their white identities to survive under this new regime? Right? Will they still say, we believe in equality, we believe in democracy, we believe in this history of black people fighting for struggle, or will we become more and more unpopular? I think under the demands and censorship, I think that there will be a push among white liberals to be much more moderate, neutral, and much more dismissive of the links that they've had or claimed. I will say claimed for the black civil rights movement and the radical black tradition. All right.
Dr. Curry,
So what? 4 years? Yes, sir.
there's a saying that a lot of the French people, middle-aged French people, the ones in their 70s, say that everybody in France was a member of the resistance after the Germans left. Do you think
Yeah,
do you think that's what's going to happen in the wake of Trump if this continues along the current trend that you're seeing?
yeah, yeah. Because I mean, listen, we keep forgetting, and this largely is a function because human lifetimes are so short, right? Because we only live for about 60 to 80 years, so we keep forgetting that people renegotiate their identities and political allegiances all the time, right? I mean, most of the white people that now claim to be liberals have families or grandparents that supported segregation, right? Because and that's not facetious. It's just that most of Americans supported segregation, right? The Supreme Court decision was extremely unpopular under the Warren Court. So, I think that under Trump, what we're going to see is a realignment of whiteness. And if Trump pulls off what he's trying to pull off, I mean, I think two things are going to happen, right? I mean, when historians write about this moment, you're going to see the mass re-engineering of American society, and I think that we have to get our people to understand that's not a crazy thing to say because that's exactly what you value in the civil rights movement, right? America was a slave holding and a racist and a Jim Crow society. Then you had this decision happen, and bam, you think the society changed in one moment. So, do we really think that our society is so insulated from these kind of epochs where you can't change it in a moment in an administration? That's exactly what's happened here. The Supreme Court passed Brown v. Board. People supported it. There was legislation behind it. There were riots. There were people where the National Guard had to be called in to get the population in order, and they adjusted and it became normalized. You see Trump doing the exact same thing. This is not unheard of within the history or the jurisprudential history of America. So, yeah, will white people realign? Will they accept the new order? Will they change white identities in politics so that it appears more moderate and creates kind of a pseudo opposition to the right? Absolutely. Because think about it. For white people to get for if white people want to take power away from Trump and these kind of white nationalists, they don't have to be pro-black. They can just be less radical. So if they take a more moderate white position that still satisfies his base, which is going to require them to sever themselves from Muslims, from black people, from immigrants, they're more than able to do that. And then you have to, this is what I'm saying, then what are you going to have to do? You have to start the whole civil rights process again, trying to radicalize white moderates into becoming leftists or radicals that support black rights. Right? This is the pattern of history. And we're pretending that these kinds of movements and resocializations don't happen. And it's not because they don't happen, it's because most of us haven't lived long enough to see them happen. Right? My grandparents saw civil rights happening. My parents fought for desegregation. I was born after that. This is just what I see in my lifetime. Right? My grandchildren won't remember this moment. This is just the vulnerability and the lack of historical memory we have because of our mortality. This is not an issue of whether or not societies do or do not forget or reinvent themselves every few generations.
All right, and I think that's where we'll put a pin in it. I want to thank my guest, Dr. Tommy J. Curry, author of The Man Not, one of the seminal scholars of Black male studies. I want to thank everybody who came through to listen. I want to thank everybody who will be listening to the replay here and in other platforms. And Dr. Curry, do you want to leave us with any parting words?
Listen, I'm over here in Scotland, and what I see happening to our people is tremendously terrible. So I hope everyone does the best they can to stay safe, to protect their loved ones, and to find some way to thrive and resist under the midst of Trump and the denial of white people. The racism in America is unbearable at this point. So my heart and thoughts constantly go out to Black Americans and the people that are suffering on that side of the Atlantic.
What are you working on that we need to look out for?
Well, Burning the Midnight Oil, trying to finish the sequel to The Man Not. Uh, and working on a book called Myths Maketh Man. That's really going to talk about the American Academy and what I think has been the mystification of how we see our struggle and how we've learned to accept the deaths of Black men on the way to what we call progress. So I'm hoping that'll be out within the next year as well.
All right, again, this has been episode 9 of the Black Male Study Sessions. You're All Black Now is the name of this conversation. This series was sponsored by the African American Men's Historical Society. To learn more about the African American Men's Historical Society, go to amhis.org and visit their Substack at amhis.substack.com. Thank you again, Dr. Curry, for taking time out of your day. Thanks for everybody who came through to
Thank
listen.
you.
This has been the Black Male Study Sessions. Y'all be safe. Everybody take care of yourself.